Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to try this again. This is take 3 of recording a lecture, and hopefully it will work just fine this time. I'm outside, it's a gorgeous day, but I hope that the fan noise in the background isn't too much. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about Washington Irving, who is known as the father of American literature. And so the lecture title is Washington Irving and the Birth of American Literature. And we've talked a little bit already about why that might be. We've talked about the kinds of things that people were writing in the early American colonies, the journals, chronicles, and histories, the sermons, the political tracts, the autobiographical accounts. Notice that they are, as we said before, largely nonfiction, right? So that is, America, before about 1820, had little tradition of imaginative or literary fiction. And this was something that was commented upon by critics around the globe. The English critic Sidney Smith in 1820 said, "In the four corners of the globe, who reads an American book or goes to an American play or looks at an American picture or statue?" There were other critics who were saying the same thing, but I choose Sidney Smith because this year, 1820, is going to be a significant year for us, and the second date so far in this course that I will want you to know, and I'll explain that when I get there. So the man who changes this, that we have little tradition in America of imaginative or literary fiction, is Washington Irving, and for that accomplishment, he's given the name the father of American literature. Irving was born in 1783 and died in 1859. He has been called by people shortly after his own time and into the present day. His significance has been hailed in various ways. Here is the American writer Charles Dudley Warner in 1881 called him the chief representative of the American name in the world of letters. The great poet and short story writer Edgar Allan Poe, whom we will also read, said, quote, "Second to no American author in the widespread popularity of his writings and in their universal appreciation by men of letters, both in the United States and England." Norton Anthology of American Literature says he was the first American to achieve an international literary reputation, for his fiction. Irving was praised by Sir Walter Scott. If you read Ivanhoe last year, Walter Scott is the author of that novel and was probably the most famous novelist in the English-speaking world in the middle of the 19th century. Lord Byron, a great poet that we read last year also. Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Thomas More, read repeatedly by Charles Dickens, admired by Fanny Kemble. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, an American poet we will learn about here shortly, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, and considered by William Cullen Bryant to be the fountainhead of American fiction and history. Irving was born in New York City in 1783. In fact, he was born just several months before the Treaty of Paris. He was born, Irving, in April of 1783, and the Treaty of Paris was signed in September of 1783 on the same day. So Irving was born April 3, and the Treaty of Paris signed September 3. Irving lived in Manhattan, and was born to a family there and was named after George Washington because of that great American general's accomplishments in the Revolutionary War. So the painting you see here is Evacuation Day, Washington's triumphal entry into New York City, November of 1783. George Washington, quite the big deal in 1783, the year that America formally won its independence from Great Britain. And so this young man born into the Irving family is given the name Washington Irving, after that great American hero of the time. New York was also, I should say, at the time, the capital, or was soon to be the first capital of the United States. And there's a story about Irving, when Washington Irving meeting the great general when he was living there. So Washington Irving was about 6 years old, and his Scottish nursemaid was taking him about town somewhere in Manhattan, and she happened to see George Washington enter a shop across the road. She snatched little Washington Irving by the hand, pulled him across the busy street and into the shop and said, "Please, Your Honor," to George Washington, "Please, Your Honor, here's a barn named after you." And George Washington put his hand on Washington Irving's head and blessed him as a little 6-year-old boy. Irving loved this story and would tell it the rest of his life. Oh, there's a picture of it. So there you go. He meets and is blessed by his namesake. The spirit of America passes from George Washington to Washington Irving in that moment. Irving is born the youngest of 11 children into a merchant family. He reads widely as a boy, but he is, by his own admission, a half-hearted student, someone who prefers adventures to studies. There are stories of him at a young age skipping out of school to go do other fun things, such as to attend the theater. Throughout most of his life, we'll see several examples. Irving was not much of a I won't say he wasn't studious, because he read extremely widely, but he wasn't much for formal schooling. He accomplished a lot of it, but was a half-hearted student, and it really wasn't his cup of tea, let's say. When Irving was 15 years old, there was an outbreak of yellow fever in New York, and so he is sent to live with friends in Tarrytown, New York. And if you look at the map on the left, you can see that Tarrytown, which is named in several of his stories, it's an actual place, an actual town in New York. It's not made up. And there, in fact, on the right is the Old Dutch Church, made famous by the legend of Sleepy Hollow, one of Washington Irving's most famous stories, the legend of Sleepy Hollow. That's the old church that Ichabod Crane rides carefully by because he's afraid of ghosts. So at 15, Irving is sent to live in Tarrytown, New York, a kind of quiet, sleepy village away from bustling Manhattan, in order to escape the yellow fever. And it's there up in northern New York that he first sees the Catskill Mountains. Now later we'll talk about Romanticism and the influence of Romanticism on American literature at this time. And this is a great romantic painting here. You can see the hugeness, the vastness, the sublime beauty and power of nature that makes the human figures in the painting look small by comparison. That focus on the beauty of nature is very romantic in its concerns. Washington Irving himself, a romantic writer, a writer of that period. Seeing the Catskill Mountains will have a great influence on Irving's artistic development, and they will go on to be the setting of his most famous stories, which are, as I said, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and then the other one is Rip Van Winkle. All right, so when Irving gets older, he does this standard end of your primary schooling trip. For his health and education, his older brothers pay for him to spend 2 years doing what they called the Grand Tour of Europe when he turned 21. The idea is that you're supposed to go around Italy, in particular Italy and Greece, and see all these famous classical sites that you've learned about in your education. New Covenant does something a little bit like that. We try to pack it into a week, so it's not quite the same. Back in the 19th century, a young man of sufficient means would be expected to spend several weeks and possibly even several months. So his older brothers, and he was the youngest of 11, as I said, had arranged a fine educational tour for him, but in another great example of Washington Irving kind of throwing off the academic expectations and doing his own thing, he meets a traveling buddy in the countryside of Italy and just ditches the itinerary of all the famous places he's supposed to go and see, and instead just tours the countryside with his friend. Now, his oldest brother, William, when he finds out about this, William's the one paying for all the travels, and he's not happy about this departure from the academic itinerary, so he sends Irving a letter. And he writes that he feels both pleasure and mortification, he says. Pleasure at Washington's restored health. He was feeling much better. He's able to travel around the countryside like this. but mortification at his decision to, quote, gallop through Italy, leaving Florence on your left and Venice on your right. William had been calculating the cost-effectiveness of this academic trip. Washington Irving had spent, say, 11 weeks in Genoa, when 2 would have been sufficient to see all of the important sights that were there. And he missed out on many of the most magnificent sights of Old Italy. In response, Irving writes a letter back to his brother and says, "I endeavor to take things as they come with cheerfulness, and when I cannot get a dinner to suit my taste, I endeavor to get a taste to suit my dinner." After his grand tour of Europe, modified, he returns to the United States and begins to study law. This was one of the expectations of a young man of a wealthy enough family that if you were going to get an education, going into law would be the kind of career that you would put that education into. But Washington Irving did not like it, and he wasn't especially good at it either. In fact, he barely passed the bar exam, he admits to friends in later letters. But nevertheless, he does pass. While he's studying law in 1807, he begins publishing stories. He's publishing works of satire. And remember, last year we defined satire as a genre that pokes fun or mocks viciously. There are kind of 2 traditions. There's the gentle tradition, poking fun at human foibles, and there's the harsher tradition that just mocks human wickedness, but both with the aim of making the audience laugh, but also correcting by mockery our misbehaviors that would not be corrected by reproof. And he rather likes this and creates with one of his older brothers an anonymous satirical magazine. So it's a magazine full of articles poking fun at the sorts of things he thinks need fun poked at them. And I think I have the name. It's named after some kind of like spicy dish. I can't find it in my notes right now, but it's named after some like spicy dish that was kind of indicating to an audience, if you like spicy stuff, here you go. This is the magazine for you. Now, in 1809, when he's around 26 years old, tragedy strikes young Washington Irving with the death of his fiancée. He writes in his journal, "I feel like one withered up and blighted. Broken heart is like a desert wherein can flourish no green thing. The romance of life is past." So we know that he takes her death hard, but he does something that might seem unexpected to us, and that is he throws himself vigorously into more of this humorous, satirical writing. Now, that might seem like a puzzle to you, perhaps, that struggling with this very dark time in his life, what does he do with that? Well, he closes himself away in libraries first. And one of his earlier biographies, a man by biographers, that Charles Dudley Warner, suggests that what Irving was doing was seeking the solace of those quiet library spaces. And he throws himself into historical research about the state where he lives, New York, and takes that knowledge that he's learning, the information that he's learning, to write a satirical history of his state, which will go on to be his first book. Here it is. It's called A History of New York. It's the brief title, but if you read the full title, you can see the satire coming through a little bit. A History of New York from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty, containing, among many surprising and curious matters, the unutterable ponderings of Walter the Doubter, the disastrous projects of William the Testy, and the chivalric achievements of Peter the Headstrong, the 3 Dutch governors of New Amsterdam, being the only authentic history of the times that ever hath been or ever will be published. The first edition added or ever will be. Apparently, we're looking at the second edition here. Right? So anyway, his first book is A History of New York. It's a satirical history of the state where he lives. And in order to sell this book to the public, Washington Irving does something that is, that's a landmark in American advertising, let's say. He kind of creates the guerrilla marketing campaign, right? The guerrilla marketing campaign is when an ad company or a corporation selling something, they put out some funny, some clever piece of art or video or something that gets everybody talking, and at first nobody knows that it's actually an advertisement for some product. You only find that out later down the road after everybody's been talking about this, let's say, viral video. And then later you find out that actually Adidas sponsored it or something, right? And Washington Irving, as far as I know, invents that time-honored by now American tradition by creating this this pseudonym, this whole character as the narrator and supposed author of A History of New York. He invents this character called Dietrich Knickerbocker, who is described as an elderly man who wears an old-fashioned colonial tri-corner hat and wears old-fashioned breeches and has some strange and old-fashioned manners and might be a little out of his mind. And how Washington Irving did this was he wrote letters into, here we go. He wrote letters into the local newspaper noting the disappearance of, quote, a small elderly gentleman dressed in an old black coat and cocked hat by the name of Knickerbocker. And he added that there were, quote, some reasons for believing he is not entirely in his right mind. So he keeps putting these announcements for a while into the newspaper saying, we're looking for this man, he's gone missing, can you find him? And then sometime after that, he publishes, he invents, he makes up and puts in the newspaper a supposed note from this guy's landlord saying, I am the landlord of Dietrich Knickerbocker and this guy hasn't paid his rent, so I busted down the door and went in because it's been weeks and he hasn't paid his rent. So I've gone into his apartment and I've gone through his things to see if there was anything that I could recover by way of the money that he owes me. And I found almost nothing in the room except this strange sheaf of papers, which I'm sending off to a publisher, and the title of it is A History of New York. So what's Washington Irving doing? He's generating this buzz, this interest in this weird, mysterious, strange figure who supposedly disappeared and is not entirely in his right mind, and has published this odd book, and his name is Dietrich Knickerbocker. Of course, all that's made up. It's Washington Irving who wrote it. With the publication of A History of New York, Irving becomes an American celebrity. The book is reprinted in England, and Sir Walter Scott, that great, most famous novelist of England in the 19th century, reads it and declared that it made his sides hurt from laughter. I want to give you just a little taste of his writing style in A History of New York. Okay, and so here we go. This is from just a little paragraph from chapter 7, containing the most horrible battle ever recorded in poetry or prose with the admirable exploits of Peter the Headstrong. Whoops, come back. Stunned with the blow, the valiant Peter reeled, turned up his eyes, and beheld 50,000 suns, besides moons and stars, dancing about the firmament. At length, missing his footing by reason of his wooden leg, down he came on his seat of honor, with a crash that shook the surrounding hills. The seat of honor would be his rump, and would infallibly have racked his anatomical system had he not been received into a cushion softer than velvet, which Providence or Minerva or St. Nicholas or some kindly cow had benevolently prepared for his reception. So he slips on his wooden leg, he falls in a cow pie, and this is the way that Washington Irving retells the story of that battle. So that gives you a taste of the kind of satire that he's writing. Irving said that his book was written in, quote, a serio-comic vein. So he is actually doing bits of history of New York, but he's poking fun at the same time. Now, I don't think I told you the date of that. It is 1809. 1809 is the publication of A History of New York. In 1815, Irving travels to England on family business, and while he is over there in England, his business fails and his mother dies back home. Now, travel between the United States and England, of course, at this time takes much longer and is more difficult to arrange. It could take months. So by the fact that he is in England, it means that he missed his mother's funeral. Again, with the loss of his mother, he turns, and with the loss of the family business, which just falls upon hard times, he turns to writing for a refuge. He's staying over there in England, and while there, he meets this great author, Sir Walter Scott. I say great author. At the time, that's how he was widely considered. Nowadays, Sir Walter Scott has fallen a bit out of critical favor. He's a bit of a B-lister, I think, if you were to ask the modern-day literary critic. I still like his fiction very much. I think it's a lot of fun, but it's not seen as sophisticated as, say, the fiction of Jane Austen, right? But at the time, Sir Walter Scott was far and away the most popular novelist. And Walter Scott encouraged him with praise for his history of New York and said, Washington Irving, if you really want to tell some good stories, there's this whole wealth of literary material in German folk tales. Read some of those and retell those. Somebody could do a lot with that. And so Irving did. And a lot of those stories that involve legends that were German folk tales, he retells and sets in the old Dutch culture of New York. And he publishes these stories in 1820. Now, I realize that the date at the bottom of this image says 1819. The reason for that is that they're published serially, so he publishes stories as he gets them finished. The collection is finished in 1820. And 1820 is also a good round number. So that's the date we're going to remember as significant in the history of American literary history, because that is the date of the publication of this first book of American short stories, short fiction, that becomes internationally recognized. And that is the Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gentleman. Geoffrey Crayon Gentleman is again the persona that Irving invents as the author of his book, and the Sketchbook is the title of this collection of short stories. The Sketchbook, finished in 1820, made Washington Irving famous and brought him the friendship of many leading British writers of the time. So while History of New York made him famous back home, it is Sketchbook that makes him famous both in the United States and in England. It includes two of his most enduringly popular short stories, which I have already mentioned, Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Over the next 12 years, Irving publishes two more collections of short stories. He publishes what are called travelogues. He's traveling through England and Europe, and he is doing historical research as he does, and writing about the figures that he's researching, the places that he's researching, and about his travels. This includes a biography of Christopher Columbus. He's appointed as the United States diplomat to Britain in 1829. So notice he's spending a lot of time as this American author. He's still spending a lot of time in England throughout this 12-year period from when he becomes famous to the date 1832, which I'll get to in a minute. So this becomes a bit of a problem for him. That is, if you've got this reputation as America's leading literary figure, but you've been living in England for 12 years, well, that's a bit of a PR problem. After 17 years abroad in 1832, Washington Irving returns to the United States. And in order to address that, partially in order, I'm sure there are many reasons, but partially in order to address that perceived problem of having been away from America too long to really know its culture, he does another travel and writing trip out through the American West, which in the 1830s is an area of increasing interest and expansion. This is a very famous painting from 1872, which we will come back and analyze and talk about later. It's called Spirit of the Frontier. So in 1846, he semi-retires from a life of travel, diplomacy, business, and writing. He semi-retires to a home that he purchases back in Tarrytown, New York. He had purchased it 10 years earlier, but in 1846, he moves there. It's fallen into a bit of disrepair, so he begins fixing it up. And throughout his life, Washington Irving had been this happy-go-lucky, sociable kind of guy, despite the misfortunes. Maybe happy-go-lucky's not fair, but a very charming, I'll say, and sociable guy. And he continues to be that in his semi-retirement. He invites authors from all over the United States to come and visit him in his home. He hosts parties that involve, dinner parties that involve authors and connect them with influential financial backers. He is one of the kind of the hot guests of New York that you'd want to have, because he's such an engaging storyteller when he comes to one of your parties or when he hosts you at one of his. So that's why I say he's semi-retired. He continued to do a little writing. He continued to stay active in the world of American literature in this kind of fatherly or big brother advisory kind of role. The last great work of his life, Irving comes full circle, as it were. Remember, he is born in 1783, the year that the United States wins its independence. He's named after the great general and first president that led us to it. And the final work of Washington Irving's life is a 5-volume biography of his namesake, George Washington. I don't know why only 4 are pictured in this image. That's a bit confusing, but there were 5 volumes of this biography. Now, so significant and well-researched is this work that it goes on to become what they call in historical studies the standard biography of George Washington for 100 years after his writing it. The standard biography is the one that any scholar of that figure would say, listen, if you're going to write anything about George Washington, the one book you have to be sure to have read is Washington Irving's 5-volume biography of him. Irving dies 2 months after finishing his 5-volume biography of George Washington in 1859, and he's buried in Tarrytown, New York, in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. The Norton Anthology of American Literature says Irving had achieved the status of a classic writer. In his own country, he had no rival as a stylist. As schoolboys, Hawthorne and Longfellow were inspired by the success of the Sketchbook, and their prose owed much to his writing. That poet Longfellow said, quote, "We feel a just pride in his renown as an author, not forgetting that, to his other claims upon our gratitude, he adds also that of having been the first to win for our country an honorable name and position in the history of letters." So there you go. That's why Washington Irving is called the father of American literature. He is the first to win for America an honorable name and position in the history of letters. Herman Melville, whose Moby Dick we will read later in the year, remembered him as one of those men, quote, "not only excellent in their works, but pleasant and love-worthy in their lives." In addition to his significance in literary history, Irving leaves us with these enduring American characters. And in particular, having just talked earlier today, actually, about the way that Benjamin Franklin is this mythic American figure, this pull yourself up from your bootstraps, start from nothing, and make it to the pinnacle of society figure. That's Ben Franklin as he presents himself in his autobiography. Well, Washington Irving gives us kind of the anti-Franklin in the enduring character of Rip Van Winkle, a story that we will read again. I believe you have already read it, but we'll look at it again. You know it's the story of a man who wakes up and finds that 20 years has passed and everything around him looks different, right? But that character of Rip is the kind of lovable slacker that we put again and again in our American fiction. So we have these 2 great mythic figures at the start of the American literary tradition. We have Ben Franklin as he presents himself in his autobiography, and we have the kind of lovable slacker in Rip Van Winkle. All right. See you later.